The first time Julian saw Ezra, he felt the air shift, like the world had tilted just enough to throw him off balance. In the sterile fluorescence of their Manhattan office, Ezra was a storm cloud in a tailored suit, distant, untouchable, and impossibly magnetic. By the end of that first week, Julian knew he was in trouble, and not the kind you walk away from. They worked at Prism Analytics, a sleek tech firm perched on the 32nd floor of a glass tower overlooking the Hudson. Julian, 28, was the new hire in data visualization, all eager smiles and earnest questions, his dark curls perpetually falling into his eyes. Ezra, 30, was the lead analyst, known for his razor-sharp mind and a demeanor so cold it could frost glass. Colleagues whispered about him. Brilliant, yes, but unapproachable. His past a locked vault no one dared to pry open. Julian, though, was never one to resist a challenge. He'd grown up in a small Ohio town, where being openly gay meant learning to read people fast, knowing who to trust, who to charm, and who to avoid. Ezra, with his guarded eyes and clipped responses, was a puzzle Julian couldn't resist solving. It started with a plan simple at first. Julian would play the wide-eyed newbie, asking Ezra for help with complex data sets, leaning in just close enough to test the waters. He'd seen the way Ezra's gaze lingered a fraction too long when Julian laughed, the way his jaw tightened when their hands brushed over a shared keyboard. There was something there, Julian was sure of it. So he leaned into the act. A little clumsy, a little naive, all calculated to draw Ezra out of his shell. "Hey Ezra, could you explain this regression model again?" he'd ask, tilting his head with a sheepish grin, knowing full well he'd aced stats in college. Ezra would sigh, adjust his glasses, and explain in that low, precise voice that made Julian's pulse race. Each interaction was a step closer, a crack in Ezra's armor, or so Julian thought. But Ezra wasn't just a colleague. He was a mystery wrapped in contradictions. He'd correct Julian's mistakes with a patience that felt almost indulgent, yet his walls never came down. One late night, as they pored over a client presentation, Julian pushed his luck. "You ever loosen up, Ezra? Like, outside these walls?" He flashed a playful smile, expecting a deflection. Instead, Ezra met his gaze unflinching. "Careful, Julian," he said, voice like velvet over steel. "Not everyone's as naive as they seem." The words hung between them, electric and unnerving. Julian laughed it off, but his heart pounded. Had Ezra seen through him already? As weeks turned into months, Julian's game became more than a game. He noticed the small things. Ezra's habit of tapping his pen when deep in thought, the way he'd linger at the coffee machine when Julian was there, the rare, fleeting smile that transformed his face. Julian's pretense of naivety was unraveling, replaced by something real, something dangerous. He wasn't just trying to crack Ezra's code anymore. He was falling for him, hard and fast, and it terrified him. What started as a playful challenge was now a tightrope walk over a chasm of feelings he hadn't planned for. One rainy Friday, the office cleared out early, leaving just the two of them. Julian, emboldened by a second glass of cheap office wine from a team happy hour, decided to escalate. "Ezra, you ever think about what you're missing, keeping everyone at arm's length?" he asked, leaning against Ezra's desk, closer than necessary. Ezra didn't move, but his eyes darkened, pinning Julian in place. "And you," he said softly, "ever think about what happens when you play games with someone who's already won?" Julian's breath caught. The room felt too small, the air too thick. Ezra knew. He'd always known. That moment shifted everything. Julian's carefully crafted facade was crumbling. and Ezra's cryptic words hinted at a truth Julian hadn't dared to consider. Maybe Ezra wasn't the one being lured. Maybe Julian was the one caught in a trap he didn't even see coming. As the rain battered the windows, Julian realized he was in over his head, and the game he'd started was about to take a turn he couldn't predict. Julian spent the weekend replaying Ezra's words, each syllable a splinter under his skin. Someone who's already won. What did that mean? By Monday, he was a mess of nerves, his usual confidence fraying at the edges. The office felt different now, like the walls themselves were watching. He caught himself glancing at Ezra across the open-plan floor, searching for a clue, a crack in that infuriating composure. Ezra, as always, gave nothing away. Just a nod when their eyes met, professional and maddeningly neutral. The next phase of their project forced them together, a high-stakes client pitch that demanded late nights and constant collaboration. Julian leaned harder into his act, but it felt hollow now. He'd ask questions he already knew the answers to, laugh a little too loudly at Ezra's dry remarks, all while his heart thumped with the fear that he was losing control. Ezra, meanwhile, was relentless in his precision, catching every one of Julian's errors, with an arched brow and a comment that cut too close. "You're better than this, Julian," he said once, his tone soft but pointed. "Why pretend you're not?" Julian's stomach flipped. It wasn't just that Ezra saw through the act. It was the way he said it, like he was daring Julian to drop the mask entirely. One evening, as they worked alone in a glass-walled conference room, Julian decided to push back. He was tired of dancing around whatever this was. "Why do you do that?" he asked, tossing his pen onto the table. Ezra looked up, one eyebrow raised. "Do what?" "Act like you've got me all figured out," Julian said, voice low but steady. "Like I'm some puzzle you solved on day one." Ezra leaned back in his chair, studying Julian with an intensity that made his skin prickle. "Maybe because you're not as hard to read as you think," Ezra said. "Or maybe I just pay attention." The words were a challenge, and Julian felt the heat of them in his chest. He wanted to fire back, to regain the upper hand, but Ezra's gaze held him captive, stripping away the pretense he'd clung to for weeks. The tension built over days, a slow burn that made every interaction feel like a chess move. Julian noticed things he hadn't before. The way Ezra's fingers lingered on a shared tablet, the way he'd pause before answering personal questions, as if weighing how much to reveal. Julian started to wonder about Ezra's life outside the office. Did he go home to an empty apartment? Did he have someone waiting for him? The thought stung more than it should have. Julian's own life was simple friends, occasional dates, a cozy Brooklyn apartment filled with plants he barely kept alive. But Ezra? Ezra was a blank page, and Julian was desperate to read it. One night, after a grueling day of revisions, they ended up at a rooftop bar near the office, a rare team outing. Julian saw his chance. Liquid courage in hand, he cornered Ezra by the railing, the city sprawling below them like a sea of stars. "Okay, Ezra, level with me," Julian said, voice light but eyes serious. "What's your deal? You're all mystery and sharp edges, but there's gotta be more to you." Ezra sipped his drink, his expression unreadable. Then, for the first time, he laughed. A low, quiet sound that hit Julian like a shockwave. "You're relentless, aren't you?" Ezra said, turning to face him fully. "What do you want to know, Julian?" Really? The question wasn't just a question. It was an invitation. A door cracked open. Julian's heart raced. He wanted to know everything. Why Ezra kept everyone at a distance, what made him smile, what kept him up at night. But before he could answer, Ezra's phone buzzed, and he excused himself, leaving Julian alone with the city lights and 1,000 unspoken words. That night, Julian couldn't sleep. He'd miscalculated, underestimated Ezra's ability to keep him off balance. The game wasn't just about luring Ezra anymore, it was about understanding him, and maybe understanding himself in the process. Julian was falling, and he wasn't sure if Ezra was catching him or letting him crash. The rooftop moment lingered in Julian's mind like a song he couldn't shake. He'd seen something in Ezra's eyes that night, a flicker of warmth, maybe even vulnerability, but it was gone as quickly as it came. Work became a battlefield of unspoken tension, every glance and word charged with meaning. Julian's plan to play naive felt like a distant memory now. He was too caught up in the real Ezra, the one who hid behind sharp retorts and a carefully curated distance. But the more Julian pushed, the more he realized Ezra wasn't just pushing back. He was pulling Julian in, deliberate and calculated, like a chess master toying with an opponent. One afternoon, a client meeting went south, and Ezra took the heat, his calm unraveling for the first time. Julian watched him snap at a senior manager, his voice low but venomous, defending their work with a passion that startled everyone. Later, in the break room, Julian found him alone, staring out the window. "You didn't have to do that," Julian said, stepping closer. "Take the blame, I mean." Ezra didn't turn, but his shoulders tensed. "Someone had to," he said quietly, "and you're too new to take that kind of hit." It was the first time Ezra had shown any protectiveness, and it threw Julian off. He wanted to ask why, to dig deeper, but Ezra's phone rang, and he was gone again, leaving Julian with more questions than answers. The turning point came during a late-night work session in Ezra's office, a small space cluttered with books and data printouts. Julian, exhausted and bolder than usual, decided to stop pretending entirely. "Ezra, what's your story?" he asked, voice raw. "You act like you don't care, but I see you. You're not as cold as you want everyone to think." Ezra froze, his pen hovering over a spreadsheet. For a moment, Julian thought he'd pushed too far. Then Ezra set the pen down and looked at him, really looked at him with an intensity that made Julian's breath hitch. "You want my story?" Ezra said, his voice low and deliberate. "Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you." Ezra's story spilled out in fragments, each word heavy with years of holding back. He'd grown up in a conservative town in Texas, where being gay wasn't just frowned upon. It was dangerous. He'd learned early to hide who he was, to build walls so high no one could climb them. Moving to New York was his escape, but the walls stayed up, a habit he couldn't break. "I don't let people in," Ezra said, his eyes locked on Julian's. "Because when I do, they leave." The confession hung between them, raw and unguarded. Julian wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap, but he hesitated, afraid of breaking the moment. Instead, he shared his own truth. "I grew up hiding too," Julian admitted. "Small town, big expectations. I got good at playing parts, naive, charming, whatever got me through. But with you, I don't want to play anymore." The air shifted, charged with a new kind of honesty. Ezra didn't respond right away, but his gaze softened, and for the first time, Julian felt seen. Not as the eager newbie or the guy with a plan, but as himself. That night, as they left the office together, the city humming around them, Julian felt a spark of hope. Ezra wasn't just a puzzle anymore. He was a person, complex and wounded and beautiful. But Julian also knew the game wasn't over. Ezra's walls were still there, and Julian's own heart was on the line. Whatever came next, they were in it together now, whether they admitted it or not. The confession in Ezra's office changed everything, but it didn't make things easier. If anything, The air between them grew heavier, each interaction laced with a new kind of intensity. Julian stopped pretending to be naive, and Ezra stopped pretending not to notice. They were dancing on the edge of something unspoken, and Julian wasn't sure if they were about to fall or fly. Every touch, accidental or not, felt like a spark. Every glance held a question neither dared to ask. Work kept them tethered, but it was the moments outside the office that started to blur the lines. One Saturday, Ezra texted Julian out of the blue, asking if he wanted to grab coffee. It was casual, almost too casual, but Julian's heart leapt. They met at a small cafe in the West Village, surrounded by mismatched chairs and the scent of roasted beans. Ezra was different outside the office. Still guarded, but softer, his sharp edges smoothed by the morning light. They talked about nothing and everything. Music, books, the way New York felt like a second chance. Julian learned Ezra loved jazz, that he'd once dreamed of being a musician before numbers became his language. In return, Julian shared stories of his Ohio childhood, the good and the bad, letting Ezra see the parts he usually kept hidden. The coffee date turned into a walk through Washington Square Park, then a spontaneous detour to a bookstore. Ezra's fingers brushed Julian's as they reached for the same novel, and neither pulled away. It was the closest they'd come to acknowledging what was growing between them. Brasco. "You're not as subtle as you think," Ezra said with a half-smile, echoing his words from weeks ago. Julian laughed, but his chest tightened. He wasn't playing games anymore, but the stakes felt higher than ever. Their colleagues started to notice the shift. "You and Ezra seem close," a coworker teased one day. Julian shrugged it off, but the comment stung. He and Ezra weren't close in the way people assumed, not yet. There were still walls between them, though they were crumbling. Ezra started opening up in small ways. A story about his sister, a joke that caught Julian off guard, a late-night text about a song that reminded him of their park walk. Each moment was a thread, weaving them closer, but Julian couldn't shake the fear that Ezra might pull back at any moment. One evening, they ended up on the office rooftop after a long day, a place Julian had started to think of as theirs. The city sparkled below, and the air was warm with the promise of summer. Julian took a risk, stepping closer to Ezra than he ever had before. "What are we doing, Ezra?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. Ezra didn't flinch, but his eyes searched Julian's, raw and unguarded. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I don't want to stop." Julian's heart soared, and when their hands brushed, he didn't pull away. Neither did Ezra. They stood there, inches apart, the world fading until it was just them and the city's heartbeat. But the moment didn't last. Ezra's phone buzzed. A call from his sister, he said, and he stepped away, his walls snapping back into place. Julian watched him go, torn between hope and frustration. They were so close, but Ezra's past still haunted him, and Julian wasn't sure if love was enough to break through. The rooftop almost kiss haunted Julian, a moment so close to everything he wanted yet still out of reach. He threw himself into work, trying to distract himself, but Ezra was everywhere. In the office, in his thoughts, in the quiet moments when Julian's heart ached for clarity. Ezra, too, seemed different. Less guarded, but still hesitant, like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure whether to jump. Julian wanted to be the one to catch him, but he couldn't force Ezra to trust him. All he could do was show up, be himself, and hope it was enough. One night, Ezra invited Julian to his apartment for dinner, a gesture so unexpected it left Julian reeling. The space was small but warm, filled with books and vinyl records, a glimpse into the Ezra he'd only seen in fragments. They cooked together, laughing over a botched pasta sauce, and for the first time, Ezra felt like a partner, not a puzzle. After dinner, they sat on the couch, jazz playing softly in the background. Julian took a deep breath. "Ezra, I'm done pretending," he said. "I want this sus, but I need to know you're in it too." Ezra's eyes softened, but there was pain there too. "I want to be," he said. "But I've lost people, Julian. I'm scared of losing you too." It was the most honest he'd ever been, and it broke Julian's heart to hear it. Ezra told him the rest. A first love who'd left when things got hard. A family who'd never fully accepted him. Julian listened, his hand finding Ezra's, their fingers intertwining. "I'm not going anywhere," Julian said, voice steady. "But you have to let me in." Ezra nodded, his eyes glistening, and for the first time, he leaned forward, closing the distance. Their kiss was soft at first, then desperate, years of walls crumbling in a single moment. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was enough. The weeks that followed were a dance of new beginnings. They navigated their relationship quietly, stealing moments in the office, on rooftops, in Ezra's apartment. There were challenges. Ezra's fear of vulnerability, Julian's impatience, but they faced them together. One night, on that same rooftop, Ezra carved a small inscription into a wooden bench. "Love sees through every mask." Julian smiled, tracing the words with his finger. It was their truth, hard-won and beautiful. In the end, Julian's game of naivety had been a spark, but it was their honesty that lit the fire. They weren't perfect, but they were real. Two men who'd seen through each other's masks and chosen to stay. As the city glowed below, Julian knew they'd built something worth fighting for. A love that didn't need pretense, only truth.